Welcome to the MBUK podcast. In this series, we'll be looking back through some of the moments that helped shape the sport of mountain biking. From the pioneers that paved the way, bikes that broke the tech boundaries, and the events that pushed the very limits of the sport, to the racers who will be forever cemented in our memories for their antics on and off the track. We'll even do our best to predict how things will look in the future. If you enjoy what we're doing, please be sure to subscribe to the podcast and share it with your mates. And if you have time, please give us a review.
Hi everyone, it's the MBUK podcast. I'm your host, Tom Marvin, and with me is my regular co-host, the man who knows everything about mountain biking. It's Rob Weaver.
Pressure's on.
And joining us in this episode of the podcast is our guest, JCW, James Costley-White. Cost, he is the head honcho of MBUK. How's it going, guys? Are we all right?
Yeah, good.
Yep, good. Thanks, Tom.
Excellent stuff. In this episode of the podcast, we are talking about the people who shaped the sport, the people who started mountain biking, the people who developed it, and the people who have grown it into the sport we love. I think that's about right, isn't that, guys?
Yeah. I mean, the people that have been arguably the most influential. Not everyone who currently rides might have heard of all of these people we're going to talk about, but they have played a critical role throughout the years.
Yeah, I mean, mountain biking has been going on since what? Like the early 80s-ish. So we're going to start with a bit of the history of the sport, where it all came from. We're going to talk about some of the racers, some of the brands, some of the people behind those companies, and some of the people who sort of brought mountain biking into the mainstream.
That's right.
Yeah. All right, well, shall we start off right at the start? Kost, you're a man who knows quite a lot about how mountain biking began. Some of the names, some of the people, some of the brands.
And that's not because you're old.
I mean, you are kind of old, but you've got a bit of knowledge about this sort of stuff. So we're starting off with the clunkers.
Yeah, I mean, people have ridden bikes off road forever, really.
Rough Stuff Fellowship.
Yeah, Rough Stuff Fellowship here in the UK. I remember seeing photos of people like using bomb craters as bomb holes in France after the Second World War. But in terms of mountain biking as the sport we know it today, you can sort of trace its roots really to California in the mid-70s. Mm-hmm. And to two people, Charlie Kelly and Gary Fisher, who were both sort of Gary certainly was a road racer. Charlie, I think, wasn't quite so serious, but was into bikes a lot. And they were roommates for a while, and they got into this kind of hobby of making what they called clunkers, which were kind of modified beach cruisers that they used to ride off-road.
They call them ballooners or something like that.
Yeah, ballooners is another word. They had balloon tyres, sort of steel frames, fairly relaxed geometry, and they started bombing down the fire roads of Marin County on these things. Mm-hmm. And then those two started a race called the Repack, which was called such because you had to repack your coaster brakes with fresh grease after every run, because they got so hot screaming down these hills.
So grease in brakes, that's something that we all do these days, right?
Don't take the wrong takeaway from this and start putting grease in your brakes. It's not a good idea. But in the old coaster drum brakes, you had to repack them with grease. And then that gradually kind of transitioned to people actually starting to build custom mountain bike frames rather than just rebuilding old beach cruisers. Joe Breeze was the first one to actually build what can really be described as a modern mountain bike, the Breezer #1. And very soon afterwards, Gary Fisher and Charlie Kelly went into business with Tom Ritchie, another frame builder, and started the mountain bikes brand.
Okay. One thing when I was reading about this, it kind of everything came a little bit full circle, because the first like ballooners, they were riding on like 650B wheels, I think, weren't they? It wasn't 26-inch from the start. It was 650B, which has obviously come back again, 10 years ago?
Well, and funnily enough, in the UK at the same time, a guy called Jeff Apps was experimenting with off-road bikes, and he used both 650B wheels and 29-inch wheels.
Right.
And 24-inch wheels. But in the end, everyone seemed to settle on 26-inch just because they were readily available. Mm-hmm. They were quite strong. Yeah, so you had the Breeze #1 in the States, you had the Jeff Apps Ridge Rider in the UK, but then obviously these were bikes made in small quantities by kind of artisan frame builders. And then mountain bikes was bigger, but still not mass market. Mm-hmm. And it was when Specialized joined the game that things really took off. There's a bit of debate as to whether Specialized or Univega deserved the title of first mass production mountain bike.
But I guess the one we all know is when the Stump Jumper was launched in 81?
81 or 82, I can't remember. Okay. But yeah, obviously that's the one that's stuck in everyone's mind because Specialized marketing to some extent is very good.
And a bike that's still around now.
And it's, you know, it's
I mean,
like,
it's changed a bit, right? But-
yeah, and it's an iconic name. It's still around now. Everybody's heard of the Stump Jumper.
And that came courtesy of Mike Sinyard.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I think when we're looking at sort of the names who are involved from the start, like there's names and areas that sort of pop up in throughout the history of mountain biking. You know, you're talking Tom Ritchie, kind of in what the late 80s. You know, Ritchie was the second biggest component manufacturer in mountain biking after Shimano. I think I read somewhere. And you know, still Ritchie is still around. You know, the P29 with various bikes. And
Yeah,
components.
absolutely. Yeah.
You know, you got Marin County or Marin Bikes. You know, Mike Sinyard, Specialized. These are all such brands that are connected with the history of the sport and is still totally relevant today.
Yeah, and these were largely guys who raced and also, you know, pioneered the tech side of the sport, and also were big personalities. Well, not all of them, but obviously people like Gary Fisher
Yeah.
are known as much for their fashion sense and their
Moustaches.
and their moustaches
Yeah.
and their kind of outspoken ideas as they are for the bikes.
Keith Bontrager around from the start. Now
Yeah.
you can't ride a Trek without one of, you know, a tire with his name all over it, a handlebar with his names on.
Yeah.
So I guess we kind of almost fast forward then to the end of the 80s when mountain bikes have got traction in the States and they start to sort of filter over to the UK.
Nice pun there. Traction. Good job.
Okay.
Oh, yeah.
Very-
That's what I'm employed for, yeah.
Puns.
Who writes the cover line?
And by this point, you've got, you know, many more brands involved. You've got, you know, Yeti, you've got Marin, you've got Kona.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. And with that, actual paid professional riders in
Yeah.
order to market those bikes, right?
Yeah.
So maybe we should start talking about a few of the big names from around the early 90s. One that always stands out to me is Hans Ray. So, you know, Hans was a trials rider. He started out in, you know, genuine sort of trials competitions. And from what I've heard, he was very, very good at it. But I guess he was a smart dude and realized he could take mountain biking to a bigger stage.
Yeah, I think at that point, so obviously mountain biking kind of started as a downhill sport. Then when Shimano and others started developing gears for off-road use, it turned into more of a cross-country focused thing, which, you know, people within the scene enjoyed, but didn't have as much appeal for people outside the scene. So when Hans came along and he was doing crazy stuff like videos with chimpanzees, and he was on this American TV show called Pacific Blue, where he was basically a bike cop who'd do wheelies to hit baseball bats out of people's hands
Like
and crazy
Miami
stuff
bikes,
like
but
this.
on bikes.
Yeah, and even worse than that sounds.
Definitely pre my time.
Yeah,
Imagine Greg Minard doing that now.
but it, you know, that changed the public perception of the sport. I guess it helped to make it a bit cooler and not just about riding around the field in lycra. So I think you got a lot to thank him for from that point of view, and also obviously the people he went on to influence. So in the UK, people like Martin Ashton and
Martin Horst.
Martin Horst.
Obviously.
Yeah. And then ultimately straight on to people like Danny McCaskill, who's obviously probably the most famous mountain biker in the world right now.
I was watching one of Danny Mac's films last night at a film festival, and Hans Ray is still in, you know, he's still featuring in Danny Mac's little films, you know. It's kind of cool.
Yeah, I mean, he's still coming to
He's still
Malvern's
relevant.
Classic. He's still riding. Yeah, still putting out videos and travelogues and things.
Hell of a guy.
Hell of a guy. No
Hell
way.
of a guy.
Yeah, if I can just rewind a fair bit.
Oh,
Obviously, we can't talk about the 80s without mentioning MBUK starting in 1988.
Wow, yeah.
well, yeah, exactly. Yeah.
But it also was around that time that the UK started to have its own proper scene and proper bike brands. So you had the likes of Muddy Fox coming out then,
And some other ones.
and some other ones. I just
well,
trying to
Rally
think now.
were big then, right?
Yeah, Rally. I mean, the Rally Mustang was everywhere, wasn't it? The Muddy Fox Courier was more of a urban bike, but it still was a mountain bike.
Well, and then Rally, the US,
Yeah.
Rally sponsored the likes of John Tomac, which was massive.
Yeah, well, and you had the big UK cross country guys like
David Baker, Gary Ford,
yeah,
Caroline
Tim Gould. You know, the UK rally team was
Alexander.
massive. Yeah,
That's what we were struggling to remember. She won everything.
yeah.
Loads of good ones.
And then in the mid 90s, you had this new wave of British talent who weren't cross country, right? Or they might have started off doing cross country, but downhill was getting bigger. So you had the likes of Jason McRae, RIP, and Rob Warner and Steve Peat, who kind of brought a more, well, I think British mountain biking was always fun, but they brought a more kind of aggressive, gravity focused side to the sport.
Well, I guess Jason McCroy, he was really well known for the fact that he went over to the US, had a breakout ride over there, racing the kamikaze. So I don't know if you've ever seen it, Tom, the head-to-head. You go as fast down a mammoth mountain as you can, racing with another rider.
Is it basically 4-cross but over a whole mountain?
Well, I guess it would
dual slalom over a whole mountain.
Yeah, doing like 60, 70 miles an hour on bikes that
with cantilever brakes and crap tires.
You'd regret riding on the road now, let alone riding down a mountain. And they still insisted on putting their saddles up.
Yeah.
Insanity. But still, he kind of, off the back of that, started to get some proper sponsorship deals. And he ended up riding, before he died, he'd signed a massive deal with Specialized, hadn't he?
Yeah, so he's riding for the Specialized factory team by the end. I mean, he's ridden for MBUK a couple of years before.
Of course, yeah. As had Warner and Steve.
Yeah, and his success obviously showed other British downhillers that they could make it. You know, we might not have any proper mountains, especially in England, but south of the Lake District. But you can still be a top downhiller. And thanks to him, you know, Rob Warner went on to win the first World Cup for a British rider, downhill rider, and then Steve Pete obviously went on to massive success. And I think we're not going to dwell too much on racing in this episode because we've got a separate episode on racing, but I think you can see once Steve and Rob became successful, the way people were riding in the UK changed. I think a lot more people were more focused on downhill, less on cross country.
Mm-hmm. Should we look back then and talk about some of the people maybe who've influenced tech and the bikes that we're riding these days? So we've gone down the racing front, as I said, but we're going to talk about those specifically in another episode. But one of the names that sort of popped out to me was Paul Turner, and he introduced the RS1 in 1989. So the RS1, RockShox 1, is that a fair sort of thing to sort of assume what the name means? The RS1 was a really influential, important product in the history of mountain biking because it kind of brought suspension to the masses.
I tell you what, I remember when the suspension fork as a whole, like the RS1 was notably the most effective, but there were others out there, and I just remember listening to cross-country racers debating whether, like a lot of the roadies do, whether it's worth adding the weight for what you get back in return.
Yeah, because
the performance compared to nowadays was pretty rudimentary.
Bogging, right?
Yeah, it wasn't great, but then you got some guys going, well, you know what? If I can stick it on and ride, a bit faster, I'll suck it up. I'll take the weight. Whereas others were like, no, it's all about saving grams. I'll stay on a rigid bike, and soon enough, those guys were switching over anyway.
The thing that surprised me when I was looking into the RS1 was that it was an air-sprung fork with some sort of like platform lockout hydraulic thing automatically built in, according to the adverts that you can find JPEGs off on the internet. I wasn't around back then. I mean, I was actually around, but I was only 2, so I didn't really know what was going on at that point. But it seemed like I just sort of assumed that suspension fork from the 80s was elastomers. And again, we're going to talk about the tech that changed mountain biking, but Paul Turner really developed this and was behind this mass adoption of suspension.
Well, that's why it was out of reach for so many people, because it's expensive.
It was $350-ish, I think, and which ended up being, in today's money, about $850 or something. So certainly not cheap, but on a par with what we're spending now.
Yeah. But I mean, I think back then, because there were cheaper options available, which would use elastomers, for example.
Sponges.
Which, you're basically shoving like almost as crude as like pencil erasers into your fork, slathering them with grease and hoping that they kind of do something. Yeah. Depending on the weather, they might not. So there were options out there, but Paul Turner made a massive impact on how we ride now. Yeah. And what we do with our bikes, out on the trails.
And I think another person on similar lines then is Gary Fisher. His name popped up earlier on. He was a guy who, he had his own brand of bikes, Gary Fisher. He then ended up, that brand, I believe, got bought out by Trek. He introduced the 29er, which, has revolutionized in many respects mountain bikes these days.
Yeah.
His G2 geometry, which was, maybe almost a precursor to the long, low and slack things we see now, with like real thinking about fork trail and rake and top tube lengths and head angles and all that sort of thing. He really was, really influential for mountain biking.
Yeah, I mean, he wasn't the only person playing with different wheel sizes, but he was definitely the one who popularized it, through the clouds of Trek. And as you say, the geometry side of things, I think I said earlier, the early clunkers were quite relaxed and kind of stable and slack head angles. And then in the 80s, it moved to more of kind of road bike style geometry as people focus on cross-country speed. And I think Fisher started taking it back towards, well, hang on, what can we do to add a bit more stability, a bit more control? So he had a big impact from that point of view.
Yeah, massive. And then you got the likes of Giuliano Furtado, who was, multiple world champ in cross country, multiple US champ, competed at the Olympics when it became an Olympic sport in '96. Started out in Atlanta. And if people recognize the name Giuliana, it's because, it's now part of the Santa Cruz group. She was a massive proponent of women-specific components. And yet Santa Cruz took hold of that and ran with it and produced, the entire line of Giuliana bikes, which are designed for female riders, which is incredible. And she kind of more or less spearheaded that.
Yeah, and I think on that note, it's important to remember the history of mountain biking has been written by men because it was such a male-dominated sport for a long time. Mm-hmm. But there were women there from the very start, people like Wendy Cragg, who was kind of documenting the clunker scene, and then Jackie Phelan, who set up Wombats, which I'm now going to struggle to remember what it stood for,
Women's Mountain Bike and Tea Society.
Ah, that's it, the Tea Society. So, right. And she was very influential in getting more women on bikes, but also in saying it's not just about racing; it is about the lifestyle. Which is something we've always celebrated in the mag.
And the tea thing, you can.
The tea thing, I can definitely get on board with.
This morning already. It's only 11 a.m.
Yeah.
What about? We've kind of touched on a bit of the tech side of it. We've also spoken about a few of the races, but what about where the sports may be diversified? So obviously there was the more traditional routes, downhill, cross-country, trials, stuff like that. But was it sort of mid to late 90s we started to see people kind of doing their own thing maybe a bit more?
Yeah, I think if you look at the kind of videos in the late 90s, the dirts and the chain spottings and what have you, you can see that trials is already starting to capture the public imagination thanks to Hans Ray and the Ashtons. And I think it's around that sort of time that dirt jumping starts to pick up a bit. I mean, I think prior to that, the bikes weren't necessarily up to it. You see the old videos of, was it Jez Avery?
Yeah.
Doing some pretty small jumps in full body armour. By today's standards, I mean, at the time, they were probably seen as huge.
They were really, they were like pretty dinky on a BMX track, if I remember rightly, yeah.
And that, I think in the early 2000s, with foot and mouth and all that kind of stuff, that proved a really good alternative to trail riding for the industry to push, but also for people who didn't have amazing trails on their doorstep. Because in those days, there weren't trail centres. You rode your local woods, and if you didn't have any local woods, you had to ride the streets. So the arrival of specific trials bikes and specific dirt jump bikes was a big thing in the 2000s.
I imagine it's also quite a good way to, again, capture that public imagination. Big thing for, the Ashtons in particular seem to be those travelling road shows that are still going on now, like the rock and roll tours, where members of the public who maybe don't ride mountain
drop and roll.
Rock and roll too. They still go on drop and roll, you know what I mean? But they're a great way for the sort of the public who maybe aren't into the mountain bike scene to get sort of some exposure to the mountain bike scene.
Yeah, definitely. And I think, like you said, Sam Pilgrim was a big part of those tours, as were people like
Sam Reynolds,
Blake Sampson.
Yeah.
And I think you can trace it even further back than that to people like Steve Gill, who really kicked off the UK mountain bike dirt jumping scene. And obviously a lot of those guys have gone on to bigger things. And, would we have the likes of Tom Eistedt today, if Sam Pilgrim hadn't helped pave the way on the world stage, I think you watch his YouTube videos today and it's easy to forget that Sam was actually the FMB World Tour champion. It's pretty amazing for a dirt jump kid.
And then
over the UK.
I was going to say then over in Canada, the free ride movement, right? I mean, that was massive. I mean, well, it maybe wasn't so big over here until we started to see some of the videos coming out, like New World Disorder and stuff like that, where you see just how insane those guys were. Brett Tippie springs to mind first and foremost. I mean, what a character.
Yeah, so the Rocky Mountain Throw Riders, as they became known, so Tippie, Richie Schley and Wade Simmons really put freeride on the map. They've been messing around on scree slopes in Kamloops in Canada for ages, but it wasn't until they started appearing in videos that it reached this side of the pond and really started to take off.
And then wasn't there MTV drop-in TV as well?
Yeah, there was drop-in TV. What was that on the Extreme Sports channel or something over here?
Yeah, something like that. And I mean,
Yeah.
it was kind of, again, it was that sort of mainstream acceptance of this quirky little sport that we've been doing for years.
Yeah.
And it was, I mean, they made it look as extreme as it possibly could be. There was definitely sort of like BMX and skateboard influences in there.
And we tried to sort of mimic it on this side of the pond. You know, a lot of North Shore woodwork sprung up and was hastily torn down by the forestry.
Dear God.
I think it's obviously a different situation here. We haven't got all the ski resorts with the uplift and all the rest of it. So I think maybe that's why dirt jumping and trials maybe was slightly bigger over here. And also we had a thriving downhill scene. So whereas the Canadian riders would go out and huck off stuff, a lot of the guys of a similar mindset in the UK would be racing instead.
It was quite a different sort of, it was a different mindset as well, wasn't it? There was this sort of highly skilled, trained racer attitude, or it felt like, I'm not saying this is necessarily correct, but it felt like then there was the free ride, which was like party even harder than the downhillers. Yeah. Just throw yourself off a cliff. It didn't really matter with how much finesse. Yeah. It was kind of, as long as you could pretty much ride it out or survive the landing, you're on to a winner.
This is the thing. In the early days, it was about, riding free in the backcountry. Then it's kind of changed thanks to people like Josh Bender to hucking your meat off cliffs.
And I mean, he really did huck off cliffs.
He did huck.
Oh my God, the videos of that back then. Did you must have seen
I've seen Josh Bender, yeah.
But then
it's not my cup of tea.
But then that led to a bit of a backlash where people were saying, hang on a minute, this isn't the way the sport should be going. And then you had people like Darren Barraclough coming along, Bearclaw, doing 360s off the road gap at Crankworks.
So all of a sudden there was more BMX influence.
So all of a sudden there's more BMX influence, and the sport, I mean, obviously it retains a crazy edge of events like Red Bull Rampage. But on the flip side of that, you have got the kind of slope style scene, which is more trick focused.
Can I say one thing that I'm quite glad that never really took off in the UK? We briefly mentioned it, was like the North Shore stuff. I watched a bit of it yesterday. The Yeti Betty film. I don't know if you guys have seen that. It's about this woman called Betty, she lives in the North Shore. She's 75 and she's still riding, and it's sort of it's a beautiful little film, and it kind of follows her, talking to her about her sort of career but first in windsurfing and then in mountain biking. Now she's been doing all this stuff for years, and it talks to some like the original builder of like the North Shore. But it's obviously got clips from like the early days of people like just riding along a plank 12 foot in the air. And I'm so glad I've never had like the pressure to get involved in that.
We used to shoot bike tests on that stuff. There was a place just outside Cheddar, right, where all of a sudden you'd find yourself up on this slippery wooden platform, balancing along while Steve Bear's sort of down below trying to take a shot. And I'm like, I'm going so slow, but if I fall off, I'm going to snap both my legs. This is this just sucks.
Well, you had people like Cliff Barberi, didn't you? Was he the guy behind that?
Yeah.
Pushing free ride in the UK. And then obviously Chris Smith on the riding front and Jim Davidge. But it never felt like it really took off. I think downhill always remained more of a core British
downhill in the dirt jump, maybe.
Yeah.
The dirt jump scene was really big.
Yeah.
I think should we move on to latterly, maybe the 2010s and onwards? And in terms of sort of really shaping the modern day sport of mountain biking, I think it's difficult to look past the likes of, and he's not the only one, but Chris Ball, who really developed enduro. And enduro in terms of tech massively pushed the sport in terms of the technology and the riding we're all doing, but it's people behind the sport of enduro, the racing of enduro. There's guys in Italy, there's guys in France and in the UK, and sort of from an Anglophone point of view, Chris Ball is hugely influential in all of that.
We kind of had the bikes to a degree. We had trail bikes. They'd sort of developed enough that they were capable and you could take them out and ride them down a mountain, which, there was a handful of them maybe early 2000s, but not loads. Generally, if you went to the mountains, you rode a downhill bike, or you did, cross country on tamer trails. But as that sort of developed, then you had the likes of Enrico Guala, I think, out in Italy, and Fred Glow in France, who saw the potential, put on these enduro races, which kind of mimicked what the rally drivers were doing, rally stage races. That then became blind racing, or, you do one pass, see the track. So quite different to downhill, big day out. And then, like you said, Chris saw the potential of that and ran with it and created what was then the Enduro World Series, which became huge. It gave birth to a different type of racing, a different type of professional rider. So, initially we had people coming across from cross country or from downhill, and some from neither, and were able to mix it up and fight at the top for those top spots. And it was to a degree, it was a breath of fresh air. It was maximum time on the bike without necessarily, being slogging your guts out in a XC race, but it was still a hard day out, and you didn't have the limited bike time that you would have if you rode a downhill bike.
I guess from a racing point of view, when you've got those two extremes of XC and downhill, from like a regular punter point of view, who, maybe is a trail rider or someone who just goes mountain biking, they maybe aren't going to be so turned on by the thought of slogging around a field as fast as they can in the Midlands, or throwing themselves down some horrible rocky chute, where you have to get a lift to the top. Enduro sort of became the mountain bike racing for the kind of the actual mountain bikers.
Yeah, like the everyday
person's race series.
Yeah.
And that was also the thing with the EWS, was that it's kind of changed now with EDR and latterly the EDS before it turned into EDR. But it was the race series where you as an absolute punter could go and race against Tracy Mosley or Richie Rude, or, like the absolute pros. You could rock up on the same start line as these guys without any real pre-qualification to do so. Made it super accessible.
Yeah, absolutely. And again, it was one of those things where I think from a media standpoint, harder to cover because of the distance. So maybe not the best for spectators or, to try and cover from our point of view. But yeah, you're totally right. On the other hand, it's stuff that we could go and ride. You can go and ride the same tracks. It's not like you can just rock up to a downhill World Cup or a cross country World Cup and pot around behind them.
Yeah.
This was an opportunity to go and experience the same as, what they were experiencing, but, probably a bit slower.
You talked about there how it's maybe enduro hasn't been the easiest way to show mountain biking. So maybe we should very quickly, before we wrap up, talk about some of the people who have sort of shown the world mountain biking through, whether it's photography, through videography, through print publishing, through internet, and one of those guys who, certainly in Britain made a massive impact on how we consume sort of rad mountain biking. Alex Rankin, who's the guy behind the Sprung series, like a magazine show almost, and then developed into Earthed, and was it Foundations he made as well? A really influential filmmaker.
Can I just say that was a beautiful segue?
Thanks.
Yeah, it was really good. Yeah. Yeah, Rankin, it was sort of the original Sprung stuff, the way he filmed it, the way he put the soundtrack over it. It worked on so many levels. It encapsulated the British scene amazingly. It also, included the video diary stuff of Warner, of PT, out at the World Cup. So you got to see some of that international stuff. For me, it was that window into that scene that just made me think, oh my God, this is exactly what I want to do. I couldn't get enough of it.
I think it made mountain biking cool, didn't it? Or it showed a sport that was cool to the wider world that it was cool.
It was proper gonzo film. I watched Sprung 1 a couple of days ago, and you've got a bit of racing in there. You've got like the student champs from whatever year
because he was down at Plymouth Uni, right? So he was down with like Joe Finney and those guys in the original film, and they're just crashing their brains out, messing around.
They're all sort of pissed up. The sort of the filming. When you got like a fisheye. It's the pictures. It just really encapsulated like the scene of like, this is a group of people having a load of fun, taking the piss a little bit, and riding their bikes and not taking it super seriously.
And the thing is, as it progressed, so almost like as Alex's skills and everything progressed, so did the scene. So it all became more professional. So what you were seeing as you went from Sprung through to the Earth series was more racing, high caliber riding, crazy bespoke stuff shot just for Alex, which was incredible. But he never lost that original sort of essence of what it was always about. It was always the riders. It was always the riding. The soundtracks were always incredible and massively inspiring to a generation, an entire generation. And, you know, I think Clay Porter's spoken about it before, just saying no one could do what he did. You know, no one could emulate it. He did it so well.
Yeah.
No one could go out and mimic it and do anywhere near as good a job. It was, for me, you know, I must have worn those videos out. I watched them so many times. I mean, I was obsessed with racing, and the way he captured it, it made it look so fun. And it was the racing and the after parties, which was the massive appeal to me.
Yeah.
The super cool ride in the wild antics on and off the bike.
Yeah.
I couldn't get enough of it.
Yeah.
I mean, I think while we're talking about wild antics and the kind of image of the sport, we need to give Sean Palmer a nod.
Yeah.
You know, we'll talk about him probably more in the racing episode, but, you know, at a time when everyone was still wearing Lycra, this crazy, like, snowboard pro suddenly appears on the scene wearing, you know, full-on Fox motocross kit and, you know, wearing a gold suit and a crown on the podium and all this kind of stuff. And, you know, this was the heyday of extreme sports, I guess, in the late 90s.
Well, yeah, he burst down in 96 in Cairns in his full head-to-toe red, white and blue Fox kit. Raced, you know, he got second to Nico by 0.15 seconds.
Yeah.
And was really pissed off.
I mean, he
Like,
was
seriously?
yeah.
Would do, wouldn't you? Right.
Yeah, but I mean, he'd been riding for like 2 years or something.
Right.
Yeah.
And just was like, yeah, it's easy. I can do this.
Yeah.
And then he pretty much disappeared again. But in those 2 years, he kind of changed the way that mountain bikers dressed and even saw themselves to an extent.
He did win in Big Bear in 99
Oh, he
in a
did.
skin suit.
Yeah, he did. it can be overstated, but I think
He upped the level of professionalism in terms of salary.
Yeah.
He was not afraid to ask for money, from what I've heard.
And he showed you could have that rock and roll spirit that someone like Missy Giove had, but he took it to another level.
And again, that was stuff that Alex documented. The parties at his house were insane. The pit bike track around his house, his neighbors must have hated it. But it was that, you know, those insights into the professional life and how wild it could be. It was just so cool.
I think when we're looking at the UK, and we'll wrap this up in a minute, but the scene is obviously defined not only by the likes of the racers and the people who are making, you know, really cool videos, but also the media that surrounds it. You know, MBUK, we've been around since 89, whatever it is. 88. I know my history. I was a year old, not 2 years old. But also, you know, the likes of Dirt Magazine, hugely influential, you know, through the likes of Jonesy, Mike Rose, that sort of people. And they obviously worked a lot with Alex Rankin.
And Mark Noble.
But you can't have magazines without photographers. And I think it's just worth spending just 2 minutes to chat very quickly about the legend that is Steve Bear, someone who's worked on MBUK since the start and is still, you know, I shot with him a couple of weeks ago. You know, this guy has been around the block, he's done everything, he knows everyone, and he's a true legend.
I wouldn't be working here if it wasn't for Steve.
Yeah.
Without a doubt. I was riding for Saracen. We had to shoot, as part of the sponsorship thing, we had to shoot the catalogue. Steve was there shooting the catalogue. I think we pretty much shot the whole thing at the edge of a car park.
Yeah.
And then he was like, oh, you know, if you want to help with other shoots, here's my number.
Yeah.
And then I was like, okay, this sounds good. I can make some money just riding a bike. Great.
Yeah.
I'm in. And yeah, didn't look back. He helped me from day one.
Yeah.
And he's still an integral part. Him and obviously Tim Manley, Steve Warland.
I think every scene has had someone like Steve. I mean, Steve's amazing, but obviously you can't overlook, you know, people like Sterling Lawrence in North America and people like Sven Martin on the World Cup scene. You know, these guys have done so much, again, to shape the image of the sport.
Malcolm Fearon before him.
And get it out there. Yeah.
Yeah.
So many people.
So I've been doing this, 10 years, and I think, you know, I read MBUK since I was 12 and read it pretty much all the way through it to when I started working, and then I stopped reading it because I didn't have time.
Excellent.
But like the first time,
God,
you know,
you're
went
making
on a
it
shoot,
sound like we work you too hard.
the first time I went on a shoot with Steve, like it was a proper like celeb moment for me. Like having seen his photos, you know, he's kind of got his style, and you see his name in the mag all the way along, and then you're suddenly there and he's taking your photo and you're like, oh my God, I can barely ride a bike. Like, what am I doing here? Like fish out of water. But a proper like fanboy moment, really cool.
100%.
I think before we wrap up, we do need to just mention, you know, obviously the sport has changed and evolved over the years, but I think it's become very noticeable in the last 10 years how many more women riders there are in the sport
100%.
and how brilliant that is. And I think in terms of people who've helped with that, you've obviously got the likes of Juliana Bikes, we mentioned earlier, and Liv, so giant female-only brands. But I think you have to applaud people like Tracy Mosley and especially Rachel Atherton as well, who've achieved on the top level, got in the magazines, got in the videos, shown that women have a really important place in the sport. Rachel especially, appearing in the Sunday Times and mainstream TV, has really helped push mountain biking forward, British mountain biking, women in mountain biking. And it's amazing now to see there's a women's free ride movement now. There've always been women racing downhill, racing cross country, but you go to a trail centre now and there are so many more women on the trails, and it's brilliant to see.
Yeah, we got a lot to thank those guys for.
Yeah.
I think Man and Carpenter as well, having moved on to do more advocacy stuff, moved on from racing perhaps and maybe less in the public eye, but actually doing some real good for not just mountain biking, but the world.
Yeah.
That's a big one.
It's quite a big one.
It's quite hefty,
There is a world outside of cycling. Who knew? What?
Yeah, and I think it comes down to making mountain biking look fun. You've got your likes of Anne Carrasco-Son, who are amazing racers, but do young girls want to emulate them? I don't know. Whereas I think people like Tani and Rachel and Manon, absolutely, you see them as a 14-year-old and you think, this is a sport for me.
Yeah. Okay, guys. Well, let's wrap it up. Thanks for all your inputs. I think it was...
God, we could go on and on, right?
The planning document we've got for this episode of the pod, there's like 40 names in there, and we have not even touched upon a lot of them. I'm gonna, there's too many to name.
There is too many.
We've got to go.
I need more tea.
Thanks for listening to the MBUK podcast. We'll be back with many more.